proceed to our lesson 4. Let's have a recap on our previous discussion. We've learned the music of Baroque period and different types of instruments during the Baroque period. Now, let's proceed to our lesson 4, we will talk about music of the classical period. First is the sonata form. Sonata form, also called first movement form or sonata allegro form, is a musical structure that is most strongly associated with the first movement of various Western instrumental genres, notably sonatas, symphonies, and string quartets. Maturing in the second half of the 18th century, it provided the instrumental vehicle for much of the most profound musical thought until about the middle of the 19th century, and it continued to figure prominently in the methods of many later composers. Although sonata form is sometimes called first movement form, the first movements of multi-movement works are not always in sonata form, nor does the form occur only in first movements. Likewise, the variant sonata allegro form is misleading, for it need not be in a quick tempo such as allegro. The basic elements of sonata form are three: exposition, development, and recapitulation, in which the musical subject matter is stated, explored or expanded, and restated. There may also be an introduction, usually in slow tempo, and a coda, or tailpiece. These optional sections do not affect the basic structure, however. In sonata form, the exposition corresponds to the first part of binary form, the development and recapitulation to the second. The exposition moves from the original key to a new key, the development passes through several keys, and the recapitulation returns to the original key. This echoes the motion, in binary form, away from and back to the original key. In relation to binary form, sonata form is complex. Exposition. The emphasis on contrast, even conflict, is the element that distinguishes the exposition of a sonata form movement from the first section of an earlier binary form. The first section of a binary movement in a Baroque suite or instrumental sonata, for example, might contain two clearly differentiated themes, but the stress is on continuity and on uniformity of musical texture rather than on contrast. In sonata form, the emphasis is more dynamic. There is a stronger sense of contrast within the movement. The terms usually given the contrasting areas are first subject per second subject or principal group / subsidiary group. These are misleading terms, for they imply a simple contrast of themes. In reality, it is contrast of key, or tonal contrast, that characterizes the sonata form exposition. Usually the opening of the exposition is firmly rooted in the tonic, or home, key of the work. The later segments of the exposition move decisively to a closely related but distinct key. The second key chosen is almost invariably one of the two keys most closely related to the home key. If the home key is a major key, the dominant key is chosen. If the home key is minor, the relative major is chosen. The thematic organization of a movement in sonata form may affect the character of the exposition, and thus of the whole movement, in two specific respects. When two themes or groups of themes are clearly differentiated, their distribution may help the listener to assimilate the cardinal points of the tonal design, that is, the arrangement of keys, of the movement. When, on the other hand, such differentiation between themes is obscured or set at variance with the organization of tonalities, the very tension between thematic design and tonal scheme may greatly enhance the subtlety and interest of the form. Such tension may produce not merely an interplay of melody and key within the movement but an interplay between two interplays. Development. The functions of the second and third main sections in sonata form follow naturally from what has been established in the exposition. Their purpose is to discuss and resolve the conflicts of tonality and theme that the exposition has raised. The development is an area of tonal flux. It usually modulates, or changes key, frequently, and any keys it settles and are likely to be only distantly related to the keys found in the exposition. It frequently proceeds by breaking the principal themes down into smaller elements and bringing these elements into new tonal or contrapuntal relations with each other. One common tactic in the classical development section is to begin with the caudetta theme that ended the exposition. The first movement of Beethoven's Cello Sonata No. 2 in G minor is an example. The impact of this device, and of the development section as a whole, is often obscured by the common tendency among modern performers to ignore the composer's instruction, present in almost all sonata form movements of the classical period, to repeat the entire exposition. When this repetition is omitted, the thematic balance of the movement is upset and the dramatic effect of the development's sudden departure from an established regularity can be ruined. Music is an art to which the controlled use of time is basic. The temporal structure of a movement cannot be altered without seriously changing the proportions of the whole. Recapitulation. Like the beginning of the development section, the point at which development passes into recapitulation is one of the most important psychological moments in the entire sonata form structure. It marks the end of the main argument and the beginning of the final synthesis for which that argument has prepared the listener's mind. The classical masters differ in their handling of this juncture. All usually prepare for it with a long passage of gathering tension. In Mozart, the return of the tonic key in subject is managed with understated punctuality, the actual moment of recapitulation gliding in almost unnoticed. Haydn and Beethoven tend to celebrate its advent with panoply. The recapitulation presents the principal subject matter of the movement in a new state of equilibrium. The main subjects of the exposition are heard almost always in the same order as before, but now both subjects are typically in the tonic key, whereas in the exposition the first was in the tonic, the second in the dominant key. As a result of the musical events in the development, the listener perceives the subjects in a new relationship, rather like a traveler who glimpses the constituent parts of a valley separately as he climbed a hill and then, when he reaches the summit, sees the entire landscape for the first time as a whole. The recapitulation can vary greatly in the literalness with which it repeats the elements of the exposition. Sometimes, as in the first movement of Mozart's Sonata in B-flat major, K570, a tiny modification in the transition that originally led from the tonic to the dominant key is enough to effect the necessary change of key perspective and keep the second subject in the tonic key. In other cases, the first movement of Beethoven's Eroica, for instance, and many of Haydn's symphonic movements, far-reaching modifications and reshufflings of the original material are made in the recapitulation. A large-scale sonata movement often creates conflicts of key and theme that cannot be completely settled even by the full process of recapitulation. In this case, the movement may be rounded off with a coda, or concluding section. Beethoven often extends the coda so greatly that it becomes almost a second development section, as in his Piano Sonata No. 23 in F minor. But this is no more an essential element of sonata form than the introduction that may precede the main movement. Now, let's talk about Lesson 5. Concerto. Classical concerto is a piece of music composed for an instrumental soloist and orchestra. It is written to feature the musical skills and expressiveness of a single musician, the soloist, while being accompanied by a large group of musicians that make up the orchestra. It was developed and became popular during the classical period of musical history, which occurred from about 1750 to 1830. A concerto is usually performed with the soloist standing or sitting in front of the orchestra. This helps the soloist to be heard over the large number of musicians that are accompanying him or her. However, it is the contrast of one soloist versus the many other musicians of the orchestra that gives the concerto its unique sound. Today, concertos are written for pretty much any solo instrument. During the classical period, however, there were fewer instruments available and several that had not been invented yet. Composers typically wrote concertos for keyboard instruments, like the piano, or for the instruments of the orchestra, like the violin, cello, or wind instruments. Notable composers such as Bach, Mozart, and Haydn wrote concertos for several different solo instruments. The form. A classical concerto is typically a longer piece of music and is broken into 3 movements. A movement is a shorter piece that is put together with other movements in order to create a large, lengthy piece such as a concerto. The 3 movements of a concerto usually alternate in tempo, or speed, with the first and third movements using a faster tempo, and the second using a slower tempo. The first movement of the concerto is usually set at a moderate to fast tempo. It is also usually the longest movement and uses a variant of the sonata form. A regular sonata form is built in 3 sections. First is the exposition, is where the main melodies are stated. Second, the development is where musical ideas are developed. Third, the recapitulation is where the exposition is restated in the tonic key. However, the first movement of a concerto uses what is called a double exposition. This means that the first section of the movement is played twice, first by the orchestra alone, and the second time by the soloist accompanied by the orchestra. The second movement leads, often without pause, into the finale, or last movement, and the finale has shown a more consistent preference for the rondo design. Cadenza. The classical concerto introduced the cadenza, a brilliant dramatic solo passage where the soloist plays and the orchestra pauses and remains silent. Near the end of every movement of a concerto is usually a moment where everything seems to stop except the soloist. The soloist takes off on a flight of fancy, all by herself, lasting anywhere from 10 seconds to 5 minutes. It is a moment devised by the composer for the soloist to show off. Cadenza is Italian for cadence. A cadence is a simple falling progression of harmonies, one chord to another, ending with a natural resting place chord. Now, be ready on our red day to discuss the whole topic about sonata form and concerto. Have a wonderful day.